An injury limited Luka Krajnovic during his freshman year at Gonzaga, but the Croatian point guard could be a sneaky breakout star for Mark Few's team next season.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome in the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by Monopoly Go. Folks, I am happy to admit it. I have a competitive side, and it is a big fan of Monopoly Go, the mobile hit twist on classic Monopoly. So join your friends and download Monopoly Go now free on the App Store or Google Play Store. Happy Friday, Zag Nation. We are discussing Luka Krajnovic today in our Season in Review series, where we discuss every player on Gonzaga's roster, talk about their history, how their most recent season went in Spokane. We'll also take a look back at our preseason best and worst case scenario projections for Luka, talk about where he fell within that spectrum. We're going to close out the show talking about his future in Spokane, what his role might look like next year, whether he could be somebody who takes over a starting role the year after that. All that covered here as we close out the week here on the Locked On Zags podcast. So we'll start with Luka's history. Krajnovic is a 6'5" guard from Zagreb, Croatia. He committed to Gonzaga on August 12th of last offseason, and I think that is a really important detail. It's an important detail for Krajnovic. It'll be an important detail when we talk about Pavle Stosic as well, of committing really late in the process. Because not only was Luka Krajnovic coming to a new country, playing in a new system, a new, just style of basketball. College basketball is different than professional, but he's also coming to a new country, new language, all that good stuff, while also not doing it in the traditional recruiting window. He didn't commit to Gonzaga a year before the school year, or even 8 months before the school year, like Jun Suk Yo did. He committed to Gonzaga in August. School starts at Gonzaga after Labor Day, like 3 weeks later. Like he was in the fire right away for Gonzaga, and I think that is an important detail when talking about players who maybe needed some time to adjust. So for Krajnovic, there was not a lot known about him when he committed as well. We found out in mid-August that Gonzaga's got a new player coming in. His name's Luka Krajnovic. He's coming over from Croatia. And there wasn't a lot of additional information about who he was. And he hadn't been on recruiting radars really up to that point. But he had played professionally in the top Croatian league, the number one league in that country in 22-23. He was playing with a team called Basko Zagreb. He played 32 games with them, played about 30 minutes per night. The team was not very good. They went 11-21. But Luka was excellent playing for this team, again, playing with professionals at the top level in that country. As a teenager, Luka Krajnovic averaged 18 points per game. He averaged about 4.5 boards, 2.5 assists, shot about 36% from three. So at that point, we're looking at a 6'5" guard coming to Gonzaga, good 3-point shot, solid, very solid numbers, playing professionally. It was just kind of hard to know what is this going to look like? And we'll play a clip later in the show of my best and worst case scenarios for Krajnovic. And you can kind of tell that show was recorded on Halloween of 2023. Like, we didn't really know what exactly we were getting with Luka Krajnovic. It was hard to know, like, is he going to step in and play a big role right away? Is he going to kind of be a little bit more behind the scenes? Now, most international players who have come to Gonzaga have not played huge roles in year one. The exceptions are the elites, the Domantas Sabonises of the world. Even then, a guy like Rui Hachimura played very little as a freshman. Many other, Filip Petrusev, like the Joel Ayayi redshirted, like the majority of guys don't play big roles in year one if they're coming over from overseas. And that ended up being the case with Luka Krajnovic. Not a significant role for him in year one. Part of that has to do with an injury, which we will get to in a second. Krajnovic finished his first season, his freshman year at Gonzaga, playing in 16 games. In those 16 games, he averaged a hair over 8 minutes per night, finished the season with averages of 2.9 points, 1.3 rebounds, 0.6 assists, and 0.4 steals per game. He was just over 52% on 2-point shots, finished 11 of 21 from there. He was 33% from three. That was on 3 of 9 shooting. He was about 79%, 15 of 19 from the free throw line. And early in the year, we saw more from Krajnovic, in part because of the aforementioned injury, in part because of the quality of opponent that Gonzaga was playing. Krajnovic played 20 or more minutes 3 times as a freshman. All of them came before December 11th. He played 20 minutes against Eastern Oregon, the NAIA school that Gonzaga played very early in the year. In those 20 minutes, he had 7 points, 4 boards, 2 assists, and a steal. He also played 21 minutes against Arkansas Pine Bluff out of the SWAC conference. Very similar numbers in that game. Also 7 points, along with 3 boards, 3 assists, and a steal. And then he played 21 minutes against Mississippi Valley State, also in the SWAC conference. 21 minutes again in that one. 3 points, 2 steals for him in that one. And then his season came to a halt because just before the UConn game on December 15th, we learned that Luka Krajnovic had suffered a hand injury and was going to be out for 4 to 6 weeks. He had it all wrapped up and bandaged up. It sounds like the injury happened at shoot-around just earlier that day. Really tough blow for Gonzaga, who already was dealing with significant depth issues at that time, depth issues that really persisted throughout the year. They just kind of found ways to play around them in the second half of the season. But Krajnovic, up to that point, hadn't really been a big rotation piece, but as we'd said, he'd had 3 games of 20-plus minutes. So it felt like there was at least an ability that they could rely on him if they needed to. But now that was taken away. And we don't see Luka Krajnovic again until January 30th. Incidentally, almost exactly 6 weeks later from when that injury happened. So the timeline was pretty much on board. He comes back on January 30th as the game against LMU, where Gonzaga just beat the tar out of them. He played 7 minutes in that game and had 6 points. But after that, we never saw Krajnovic get back to that same 20-plus minute per game threshold. In fact, he only played double-digit minutes twice for the rest of the season after that. Part of that was the quality of competition. Being in the WCC, Gonzaga wasn't blowing out teams as much as they typically do. I think they were also just kind of easing him back into action. As you'll recall, the difference between playing, even significant garbage time minutes against teams like Eastern Oregon and Mississippi Valley State, and then missing 6 weeks as Gonzaga transitioned into the hardest part of their schedule and then into conference play. I think it's pretty understandable why he wasn't thrust back into a 15, 20-minute per game role, even if there were certain games where he probably could have been on the floor longer than he was. Those 2 games where he played double-digit minutes for the rest of the season, one of them was against Portland in early February, 15 minutes in that game, had 7 points, 5 boards, a steal, and an assist. And then the other one was Gonzaga's dominant first-round victory in the NCAA tournament against Will Wade and McNeese State. Krajnovic played 11 minutes in that one, had 7 points, including hitting a 3 that nearly gave Anton Watson that coveted triple-double. He fell 1 assist short. Krajnovic also had a rebound in that game against McNeese State as well. So now the question is, how did this season, and obviously the injury played a huge part in the year, but how did it compare to our preseason expectations for Krajnovic? And we're going to talk about that in just a second. But first, I want to tell you that today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by Yahoo Finance. Folks, wouldn't it be great if you could see all of your investment and retirement accounts in just one place? With Yahoo Finance, you can consolidate your views from multiple accounts into one hub and access the expert analysis that you need to tend to your entire portfolio with confidence. I used to try to do this all on my own with a self-made spreadsheet, and folks, it was just way too much time, way too much trouble. But I recently switched to using today's sponsor, Yahoo Finance, and I've never looked back. For more than 25 years, Yahoo Finance has been the brand behind every great investor. Whether you're a seasoned investor or just looking for that extra guidance, Yahoo Finance gives you all the tools and data that you need in one place. Securely link your brokerage accounts for a unified view of your wealth, including 401k and other investments. A comprehensive perspective is what sets apart great investors, and it's how Yahoo Finance ensures you have the insight to look at your wealth in its entirety. For comprehensive financial news and analysis, visit the brand behind every great investor, yahoofinance.com. The #1 financial destination, yahoofinance.com. Again, that is yahoofinance.com. Today's episode is also brought to you by eBay Motors. Folks, passion, drive, and patience, that's what brings home the winning trophy, and it's also what helps keep your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. Plus, with over 122 million parts to choose from for your ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your car every time, or you get your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices that you want, it is easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that W. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply, and eBay's Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and we're still going through the Luka Krajnovic season in review episode, part of a series discussing every player on Gonzaga's roster. We've already done one on Anton Watson. We've already done one on Jun-Suk Yo. And what I want to do now, for those of you who listened to those episodes, you recall in the second segment, we played a clip from an old episode back from before the season started, talking about the best and worst case scenarios for each player. I'm going to play a clip for Luka Krajnovic. It's about a little under 4 minutes long. And then afterwards, we're going to recap it. What parts of the best case scenario did come true? What parts of the worst case scenario came true, if anything? And we're going to kind of break it all down. So here's this clip from Andy back on Halloween of 2023. Well, the best case scenario for Luka Krajnovic is that he displays the ability to play both the point guard and the shooting guard position in Gonzaga's offense. I suspect it will be more important for him to showcase those combo guard abilities. That's what they brought him here for. That's the role he played in Croatia. And they have two very established point guards in Nembhard and Hickman. I think that Nolan Hickman's the backup point guard. Luka Krajnovic isn't the backup point guard. When Nembhard is not on the floor, Nolan Hickman will be on the floor and he will be playing the point guard. I also expect Ryan Nembhard to play something like 33, 34 minutes per game. So there will not be very many minutes where Nembhard is not on the floor. And when they are, I think Hickman will probably be playing the one. I think Krajnovic might be on the floor alongside Nolan Hickman in those minutes, but I think he's more likely to play the two off-ball role. But in a best-case scenario, Krajnovic shows the ability to play both positions, which makes him more versatile and makes him more valuable as a bench piece for Mark Few and the Zags. Best case scenario for Luka Krajnovic is that his outside shooting is an immediate weapon. He comes in, he comes off the bench, he bombs threes, he knocks them down. 40% in his first year as a freshman would be incredible. We're talking best case scenarios. Could it happen? Heck yeah. About 35% in Croatia last year. Billed as somebody who's a really good shooter, looked good as a shooter and craziness in the kennel. Him coming in, dealing with Division I college basketball floor spacing, a little bit different situation, high octane offense, getting a lot of open looks. I could see him coming in and just knocking shots down. And in that best case scenario, he is clearly doing that and is immediately valuable to this Gonzaga roster because of that outside shooting ability. The best case scenario for Luka Krajnovic is that the experience he has gained playing against older players professionally gives him a leg up as a freshman for Gonzaga. This could happen in multiple different ways. I think a big element of it could be his ability to impact the game defensively. What are the worst case scenarios for Luka Krajnovic? Well, it's that the adjustment to college basketball takes time. Something that has been the case for basically every international player who has come over. You could maybe make an argument that Domantas Sabonis looked ready from year one, but he also spent a lot of time in the States. His dad played in the NBA. Like, that's a bit of a different situation. Even some of Gonzaga's best international players ever took time. Kelly Olynyk took time. Shemet Karnowski took time. Like, this doesn't, Rui took a ton of time. Like, this does not happen right away. And for a player who did not commit to this program until August, it is fair to expect that there is a learning curve that might prevent him from being a big-time contributor in year one. Many international players redshirt in year one or play very little. Again, Rui is an example. Martinez Arlauskas is an example. Filip Petrusev is an example. I don't expect Krajnovic to redshirt. I don't think that it would be the worst-case scenario. There are things that could happen that would be, I suppose, worse than that. But I don't think that's the case. There's not enough guard depth on this roster for Krajnovic to redshirt. So I don't expect that to be the case. But I do think that a worst case scenario could develop where he is just kind of outside that rotation. He's the 10th guy. Ben Gregg is 6th, Dusty Stromer's 7th, Jun-Suk Yo is 8, Braden Huff is 9, and Krajnovic is 10. And in a 10th man role, you're playing 3 to 4 minutes per game. You're playing Some games you play 8 minutes because the game's way out of hand. Sometimes you don't play for 2 weeks, 3 weeks at a time, or you play 1 minute in a 3-week span. That is a role that has always existed at Gonzaga. And in a worst case scenario, again, for Krajnovic, that is his role next year. And what's interesting about these worst case scenarios is it's not necessarily bad. It's dependent on how things go from there. Well, we definitely weren't right about projecting Braden Huff to be the 9th person in the rotation behind Jun-Suk Yo, but that is a testament to how much we were not expecting Braden Huff's breakout season in particular. With regard to Krajnovic, I think it's pretty clear that we erred more on the side of the worst case scenario than the best case scenario. Of course, for those of you, I didn't include it in this clip because I didn't want that clip to run any longer than it was, but I've always explain my best and worst case scenarios as being best case within reason, worst case without injury. And so obviously the injury played a part in Luka Krajnovic's freshman season. If he had not been injured, there is a real possibility that some of the things that we talked about in the best case scenario, including his playing time increasing as the year goes on and him improving and kind of showing some of that stuff, would have happened, but we didn't get to see it because he missed 6 weeks with the hand injury. So I think that plays an obviously significant role in trying to evaluate Krajnovic's first season through this best case, worst case scenario lens. But looking at the things we said on the best case scenario, we talked about him bombing threes and knocking them down. That would have required him to play in a more significant role. Again, 3 of 9 from 3 is just not a big enough sample size to know. I said that the best case scenario for him is shooting 40%. If he had literally taken and made one more 3, that would have been 4 of 10. That would have been 40%. So it's just the volume wasn't there for that to be something we can really judge at this point. Talking about him having experience playing older players and how that could help him defensively, I think based on the eye test, we did see some of that. But again, I think you got to take some of that with a grain of salt in the sense that a lot of the minutes that Luka Krajnovic played this past season were in the second half against not very good teams where those teams were playing their backups. That's not to say Luka Krajnovic cannot impact Gonzaga defensively against the best teams that they play. He certainly is there's the potential for him to be able to do that. We just didn't see him play a lot of minutes in that situation, so we just don't know. I still maintain that I think he has the ability to be a good to an average to significantly above average in the best case scenario defensive guard for Gonzaga, just based on his build and his size, and I think his basketball IQ. But we didn't really see those best case scenarios because they were all based on him playing a bigger role than he did. But when we talk about the worst case scenario, I think, again, we talked about the worst case scenario being him being 9th or 10th in the rotation. That effectively is what happened. Obviously, Braden Huff was a bigger role in the rotation at the time of this recording. Steel Venters was expected to be in the rotation, but Krajnovic kind of floated around that 8-9 spot in the rotation. But I don't think that what we saw from Krajnovic is all that alarming. And I think I say that when I talk best and worst case scenarios of like, even if the player is at their worst case scenario, like in certain situations, a lot of what's happening is behind the scenes. Luka's developing behind the scenes. He's getting better in practices. He's getting better as he just gets more comfortable being in the United States, being in Gonzaga's offense, learning from his teammates, things that we're just not going to see and that aren't going to show up in the smattering of playing time that he got down the stretch. So whether this season actually fell into the quote unquote worst case scenario or not, it's kind of a moot point until the following year, or maybe even 2 years from now is when we'll have a better sense of how much development and growth behind the scenes Luka did this season in Spokane. And that's what I want to talk about to close out the show. Can Krajnovic crack the rotation next season for Mark Few and the Zags? And what does his overall future hold in Spokane? We're going to talk about that in just a second. Right after I tell you that today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Folks, the weather out here in the Pacific Northwest, it is heating up, and that means it's time to go take in some baseball games. And great news, Gametime is now an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which means getting tickets is even faster and easier. And prices on the Gametime app, they actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. So with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and Gametime's lowest price guarantee, Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. And one of my favorite features is their last-minute deals. You can save up to 60% off buying last-minute for not only sports, but concerts, comedy, and theater as well. And I often worry about my tickets, especially if I buy them from certain unnamed third-party sources, that they might be bogus. Bogus. But with Gametime's ticket coverage, your purchase is covered by the most flexible customer service policy in the entire ticketing industry. I love having that peace of mind. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app today, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last-minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, folks, closing out the show today. We talked about Luka Krajnovic's past. We talked about how this last season went in the lens of our best and worst case scenarios. Now we're talking the future for the Croatian guard. And right now, one of the things that's going to be kind of fun about doing these season in review episodes, kind of looking ahead to the future, is that Gonzaga's roster is not changing all that much. So I think an immediate look at next year's roster is that most players' role isn't going to change all that much. Graham Ike, Ryan Nembhard, Nolan Hickman, Ben Gregg, your starting four that's returning. None of their roles are going to change all that much. Michael Ajayi is not quite the same player as Anton Watson, but you expect his role to kind of be a starting small forward role. Steele Venters is one of the bigger wild cards, but for the most part, most players' role isn't really changing. And right now, that's kind of where we're at with Luka Krajnovic. I think he's right on the edge of having a regular role in 2024-25 because, again, we don't know exactly how his role was going to materialize as a freshman because of the hand injury. I don't think that the hand injury is prevented him, like if he hadn't gotten hurt, that he'd have all of a sudden been playing 18, 20 minutes per night for the rest of the season. I don't think that the injury impacted his playing time at that level. But I do think that it curtailed him from potentially finishing the season more or less in the rotation. And I think that with a strong offseason, players show a ton of growth from year one to year two. It is not uncommon at all. And with an entire offseason at his disposal, learning the system, kind of going back through the game tape and learning his mistakes, the pros and cons, another year working with Ryan Nembhard and Nolan Hickman and all that, I think there's an opportunity for Krajnovic to have a rotation role for the Zags this upcoming season. But again, both Ryan Nembhard and Nolan Hickman are still going to be here. And neither of them are going to have their playing time plummet in their next year. It's not going to happen. I think that for the best case scenario for Gonzaga in general is probably that Nembhard and Hickman are not quite as relied on as they were the last year. Especially early in the season, it was just a clear issue how much Gonzaga rode those guys. They played 40 minutes in every important game for Gonzaga. It was too much. So I think a good scenario for Gonzaga would be Krajnovic being able to absorb more of those minutes and kind of playing a consistent third guard role. I'm curious if Gonzaga is going to try to continue to develop him to be able to step in as a point guard or if they view him more as a combo guard. Because the nice thing about having both Nembhard and Hickman is that when one of them's on the bench, the other one can play point guard. Nolan Hickman, clearly, we saw it last year, is better suited as an off guard. But he can play point guard. He's done it in the system for years. If Nembhard's on the bench, Hickman stepping into the point guard role is entirely something he's capable of doing. But does Gonzaga view Krajnovic as somebody that they want to be able to eventually do that long term? That's something I'm going to be watching for closely this year. I think ultimately Krajnovic can be the third guard on this team. And it's tough because it kind of depends on there's three small forwards on the roster effectively in Michael Ajayi, Steele Venters, and Dusty Stromer. Some of those minutes are going to be shifted to the small ball four, I think primarily for Ajayi in particular. But in order for those three guys to all get minutes, some of them are going to have to come at the two as well. And I think either Venters or Stromer could potentially play some more minutes at the two next year, which would cut potentially into Krajnovic's playing time. But ultimately, I don't think Krajnovic is going to be like a 25, even 20-minute per game guy off the bench. I'm not even 100% sold that he's a 15-minute per guy coming off the bench. But if you gave Luka Krajnovic 8 to 10 minutes consistently, he played 8 minutes per game last year in 16 games because of injury. If he played pretty consistently 7 to 8 minutes a game, and in blowouts, he played more like 12 or 15 minutes, and in tight games, he played more like 2 or 3 minutes, but generally he was playing every game. I'm not saying that he's going to be a breakout necessarily, but that's the kind of step you want him to take. More confidence from Mark Few, more ability to play a consistent, regular night in and night out role, potentially even playing a little bit of the one and a little bit of the two. I think all of that seems very possible for Luka Krajnovic next year, assuming the roster holds the way that it is. And that is the assumption right now. because Gonzaga is eyeballing Trent Perry out of the 2024 recruiting class, the decommit from USC. They're eyeballing Nolan Traore. I don't know that either of those players are likely to come to Gonzaga, but that's not the point. The point is that they're looking at them. They're also looking potentially at Wesley Yates, transfer from UW, who didn't play last year. They've contacted Rowan Brumbaugh from Georgetown, transfer as well. There's other Ian Martinez from Utah State has been contacted. They were reportedly involved with a couple other players who have already committed in the transfer portal. So Gonzaga is looking for some guard depth. And if they find it, that could seriously impact Luka Krajnovic's role to the point where we'd have to wonder what he would want to do. Because right now, I think he's 9th in the rotation with the roster as currently constructed, behind a starting lineup of Ryan Nembhard, Nolan Hickman, Michael Ajayi, Ben Gregg, and Graham Ike, behind Braden Huffs, Steele Venters, and Dusty Stromer. That would put Krajnovic 9th. But if they add somebody else, and that person is going to take guard minutes, whether it's a point guard, whether it's a combo guard, whatever, that would push Krajnovic down to 10th. And then you wonder, what is he going to do? I don't see Luka Krajnovic as transferring. I don't think it's a super likely option. I'm not sure what the interest level would look like because he didn't play very much last year because he dealt with the injury. I'm just not sure I see that. It doesn't seem all that likely to me. I also think that Krajnovic was probably communicated with ahead of time about, hey, we ID you as maybe a 2-year guy, a 3-year guy. Because right now, the role that is available to him as a sophomore is not particularly big. But the role that could be available to him as a junior, folks, it could be huge because there's going to be no Ryan Nembhard in the 25-26 season. There's not going to be a Nolan Hickman in the 25-26 season. There's no guards who are going to be on the roster at that time. Gonzaga is heavily involved in the 2025 recruiting class for that exact reason. That's why they're looking at guys like Isaiah Harwell or Jalen Harrelson or others that they're pursuing in that class. That's why they're looking at some of the 24 guys or the younger guys who could potentially step up, like Yates or Brumbaugh or Perry or Traore or anybody like that. But right now, if you were to just make a depth chart going forward with what we know about Gonzaga's roster, Luka Krajnovic would be starting for the Zags in 25-26. And if Gonzaga believes he's capable of taking a jump this year where he plays a bigger role, 8 to 10 minutes per game, contributes more at the 2 and the 1, you could see him potentially being a guy who steps into a starting role as a junior and breaks out. Like, that is not outside the realm of possibilities. He has to be willing to stick it out. And I know in the transfer portal era, there's a lot of consternation among the fan base that any player who's expected to be here for more than a year won't do that, despite the fact that Gonzaga really hasn't had a whole lot of players transfer out. Last year had a couple of them, but that was all kind of understandable reasoning. But I can see why that is a concern for the fan base. I also think Gonzaga is going to continue to add guards around them. They're not just going to throw all of their eggs into the Luka Krajnovic starting as a junior basket, nor should they. They shouldn't do that for any player. But I do think that there is the potential for him to develop still in a smaller role this year, but that development will look promising enough that by the time his junior year rolls around, when that veteran backcourt is when both those players are gone, that Krajnovic steps into a much bigger role. Hopefully he sticks around long enough to do that. I don't see him going anywhere, but I've been surprised by these things before, so you never know. That's going to wrap it up for us today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. For this day and for this week here, we're going to be back on Monday. We're going to do mailbag. As always, we're going to talk about a 2026 recruit the Zags are pursuing in Sam Funches. We got some updates on the women's basketball team and the transfer portal as well, all coming up next week. Want to thank all of you for making this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Hope Zag Nation has a fantastic weekend. And until Monday, as always, go Zags.